Okay, so my name is Christy Orr, and I am the Director of Disability Service or Disability Resources. Oh my goodness, I almost said the wrong name. I have worked on this group of presentations with Dr. Megan Orsag from the Center for Disability and Development. Unfortunately, she could not be here with us today. So if you've seen this before, she does a much better job of introducing, but I'll do my best to fill in her shoes here. This is part of the series that we've been doing for the month of April and in the first 2 weeks in May about accessibility from different experts across campus. And then our last presentation will actually be the middle of May. I think it's May 13th. Hopefully that's the right date. Dr. Amanda Krause from the University of Arizona will be presenting about microaggressions and bias. It will be an excellent presentation. I've seen her do it a couple of times before, so I highly encourage you to come to that presentation if you're able to do so. But today's presentation is providing access in student organizations and activities. You are welcome at any point to submit questions using the chat feature, and I'll be monitoring that feature and we'll be able to ask Tracy those questions. Please do leave your microphone off during the presentation just so we don't get any background noise. I'm sure you're all very familiar at this point with that protocol. Today's presentation is done by Tracy Foreman, who is an assistant director in the Department of Disability Resources. Tracy has a master's in educational administration from Texas A&M and has worked in disability resources for over 15 years. She currently works as both an assistant director and as an access coordinator, which means that she works directly with a caseload of students. And in her case, she works directly with the students in the Health Science Center and the College of Geosciences. She serves on our department leadership team, supervises assistive technology services, and participates in a variety of campus committees and liaison roles. She has consulted with various student organizations on proactively planning for accessibility and how to respond to specific accessibility requests. And she also serves as a student organization advisor. So she has a lot of knowledge in this area. I know most of you are staff and maybe a few faculty members. And hopefully this information will help you be able to support students and student organizations, but will also be able to be generalized to a lot of different areas that you may work with disabled students. So I am going to turn it over to Tracy for her presentation.
Thanks, Christy. I thank you all for being here. I'm excited to see a number of names I know and also some people I've never met before. So I welcome you to join us today. My plan is, and I believe that Megan sent out the handouts and the presentation. I made a few tweaks since last week, but nothing that's significant. I just wanted to kind of do a real global overview on what you need to think about. So just to consider that accessibility, and we talk about this in our office with disability resources all the time. Accessibility is not a disability resources responsibility. It's a university-wide responsibility. Everybody who is in the community has some role to make sure that our campus and our activities and our programs are accessible. And if they're a recognized student organization, there's definitely that expectation that they will do that same thing like we expect of our offices and faculty and stuff. So student organizations need to consider what students might need, students, and not just students, because a lot of our organizations also work not just with students, but guests, parents, they may have prospective students. They have to think about any person with a disability who might need some sort of accommodation. They need to be prepared to respond to those requests. And even better, plan ahead so that you don't have to do as many accommodations. That's what we're going to kind of focus on today. I'm going to do a brief review of accessibility requirements just to make sure we're kind of coming from the same perspective. I want to talk about what those common disability barriers are and accessibility needs would be. Talk about some best practices and things that the organizations and advisors can do to plan ahead. I want to give you some real life examples of things that either I have dealt with or have come to our office or have been brought up like after the fact to process to hear what some of those potential needs have been and how we've worked through those. And then I want to talk about some campus and community resources. So if you as either a student organization advisor or a staff member can kind of know where to point to or where to go to on campus, you'd have questions about this topic. So I think most of you have been through the series, but just this quick thing, there are certain laws that kind of guide this process. So Texas A&M is a public university, and those recognized student organizations are also expected to follow those requirements since we're public and many of our things are federally funded. So the things that govern us, the Americans with Disability Act is a big one. It's that civil rights law that the goal is that it's trying to prohibit discrimination about for people with disabilities. Now, it's everything from their public life, job, school, transportation, anything that's open to the public needs to be accessible. We're a public university, so our facilities and programs and events need to be accessible. If you want to learn a lot more, there's 4 titles to the ADA. You can go to the ADA National Network and read what those things are. Then there's a Rehabilitation Act in 1973. So you may have heard like Section 504 or Section 508. This is really what it talks about, like, you want to make sure that everybody with a disability has an equal opportunity to participate and receive the benefits of the programs and services that are available. And so it also has that definition of what is a reasonable accommodation. So a lot of what our office does is we determine what is a reasonable accommodation. It defines what that is and kind of gives some guidelines. And then there's Section 508 of that guideline, which is the thing that kind of governs the technology, access to websites and software and anything that may be some sort of electronic information. And so understanding that those are things that govern us. And so when people ask, well, what do I have to do or what's required? We typically will start looking at these, and then there's a lot of other things that will come as far as Texas Accessibility Code and standard administrative procedures for the state of Texas, for Texas A&M systems. There's a lot of other things that fall in there, but these are the 2 main things that will kind of guide what we're trying to do and what we have to do. I think most people know this, but just as a quick review, we're talking about the types of disabilities that are out there. So I'm just going to try to make my screen a little less busy. So an individual with a disability is, somebody who has a mental or physical impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It also could be a person who has a history of an impairment or a person perceived as having an impairment. So when we're looking at those major life activities, I think most people think about the most obvious. People have some sort of mobility impairment, a hearing impairment, a visual impairment. But the way it's defined, when you look at the ADA and the ADA Amendments Act, it talks about caring for themselves, manual tasks, seeing, hearing, eating, sleeping, walking, standing, lifting, bending, speaking, breathing. And then the ones that really come up when you're looking at an educational it's about learning, reading, concentrating, communicating, and working. So if you're wondering about the most students who are most common disabilities that are reported at Texas A&M, we have a statistics page, and I'll pull it up in just a second, but our top 4 categories of types of disability reported to our office are ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, mental health disabilities, so we're talking about people who may have anxiety conditions, depression, bipolar, things that may affect their mental health. In learning disabilities, commonly dyslexia or dysgraphia. Health-related, which is a huge category. So you're talking about people who have diabetes, they have chronic migraines, celiac, seizure disorders, autoimmune. A lot of things fall in that, and that may impact them, especially in a student organization or student event or activity. And then there's a lot of other categories. So one of the things I was going to share is if you ever want to look at this information on our statistics page on our website, which I had open, where are you? Head over here. Sure. So we have a list of, like, for the last 10 years or so, the numbers of disability diagnoses that have reported to our office. So if you look down here on the fall column, you'll see like ADHD, we had 1,285 diagnoses of ADHD reported to our office. The ones that people think about, you're thinking about like the visuals, number 72, for somebody with a physical or orthopedic 114. Not a lot of numbers, so you may not see that as frequently, but sometimes people have a significant physical, visual, or hearing disability, may need the most or more complex accommodations. But keeping in mind that if there's that many people in the community who already have these disabilities, you should be planning for these kind of accommodations that will come up in these type of student organization events. Back over. So what are the barriers that we typically see? And this really is not just for student organizations, but when I was trying to think of it in the student organization, I tried to give it some sort of categories. I think the first thing is the physical space and the mobility. In the thing about just even the basic student organization meetings, to a social, to a conference, to a major event, what are the wheelchair or mobility device accessible paths that are available for them? I've had students who are wheelchair users who struggle with going to student organization meetings when they're in Rudder Tower, because if you've ever been at the 7 o'clock time frame to get into Rudder Tower to go to a meeting, there's a giant line and a bunch of crowded people trying to get up to the 5th, 6th, 7th floor. And if you're in a wheelchair, that's really intimidating to get up there. And then you go into the meeting room and there's rows of chairs and there's no space for a wheelchair user. So that can be very a barrier. It can be really intimidating for somebody who uses a mobility device to participate in that type of activity. When you're doing large events with dining, and you have tables in round circles. If people can't physically get to or around and up to there, that's also a barrier. How do you space those out? Is this a welcoming environment for somebody who may have some sort of physical limitation to navigate? Signage, when we're planning conferences for our national and state conferences, we're always trying to make sure that the signage is going to be useful for somebody with low vision, who might be blind. Are things well labeled so that people can find their way? They're in good color contrast. Transportation options and availability. Obviously when you're going on events, so if you're typically take the 15-passenger van to go on your retreats, what would you do if somebody couldn't use a 15-passenger van? You might need an accessible type of transportation. I'll talk about that as an option. But I also say is transportation available to get to your meeting or event? One of the groups I work with is Aggie Adaptive Sports, and when they're trying to plan activities, we sometimes try to plan them on the weekends. I'm like, well, what if somebody can't drive? What if somebody can't take there's not an accessible bus or van at that point? If they can't get to your event, that's the barrier. So you thought about when you're going to plan those activities, when is there going to be transportation that's going to be accessible and available to that population? Obviously, accessible parking, anybody signing up for a conference who needs that they want to know where they can park, how they can get close, students trying to figure out how to get to class and to meetings and things on campus, where is that accessible parking? Lighting of your meeting space, so thinking about how dark is the space, and if somebody did have a visual impairment, had trouble seeing what was going on, could they navigate well in that lighting? When I talked about interpreters, appropriate lighting for an interpreter in that space. And then large crowds and noise. Sometimes people don't think about that, but you deal with someone who might have an autism spectrum disorder or an anxiety. They may really struggle in a large crowd or in loud, noisy areas. And so I'll talk about Fish Camp a little bit down the line, but to kind of think about how some people with certain types of disabilities might be impacted by the type of organization or the type of meetings or gatherings that group would have. My second area is communication access. So, how are the acoustics in the space that you're talking? Is there amplification, available? Do you have a microphone but you're not using it? One of my biggest pet peeves is people who will stand up in the front of a large room and be like, hey, can you hear me? Do I need to use the microphone? Okay, and they just go. And they don't think about, well, what if somebody really had a hearing impairment and really couldn't hear you? The background noise was really hard for them and they're not gonna be able to hear what's going on. And so again, will they come back? That's the environment that they're gonna go to if they go to that large group meeting or that activity. The background noise, sometimes you don't have control over that, but how do you make sure that you get that background noise to be minimal so that if somebody does have a hearing impairment, that they will be able to hear that, or if they have some sort of auditory processing disorder, it'll be less of a barrier. And then the opportunity to have those communication access accommodations like a sign language interpreter or transcription available. If there's not even an opportunity to request that, would they come and participate if they know that when they got there, they'd never be able to pay attention or understand at that point anyway. Inaccessible materials is my third category. So, materials that you promote your events or activities or communication that are not accessible for people with visual or hearing disabilities or other learning disabilities. So we look at if they have a website that they're promoting things on, do you have the basic web accessibility things in there, like putting alternative text for your pictures, the color contrast, is that okay? Or if you're putting PDFs on your website for forms and applications, are those accessible? A lot of student organizations do communication through emails and social media. We get student groups that'll send stuff to our office and asking us to forward them to students. And it'll be just a basic GIF in the memo saying, hey, please tell them to come to my event. Well, if that GIF is just a picture, there's no text and it's not described, it's not accessible. So I'm not going to send it out because I know that's going to be an inaccessible advertisement. I don't want to do that. So I sometimes will go back to that student and say, hey, if you can provide it to me in a different format or a more accessible format, then we can send it out to you. A lot of people put videos out on their social media or their websites and they don't caption them. Or they just put a picture, but there's no description of what's in that picture and they wouldn't be able to understand what's going on in that posting without that information. And then you have the people who have just paper handouts. I've walked with students with visual impairments through their MSc Rudder area and people are handing out flyers and I might be with somebody who's visually impaired and they look at me and go, well, they're not going to read this and I don't have anything else to give to them that's accessible. So, is there another way that they are promoting it? There are alternative formats of the materials that they're using to promote their activities. And then I have this category of other. So, there's other things that you may have to consider. I come back to that large crowd and loud noises. Some people with social anxiety, autism may not be comfortable with eye contact, hugs. A lot of our organizations are very social. And they, in a non-pandemic time, maybe more into the, they like to get together and hug, and they're very touchy-feely, and that might be very uncomfortable for somebody. So how do you address that? Food, whenever I talk to anybody planning a conference or a large event, have they thought about dietary needs? And we think about religious and vegetarian and other things, but also if somebody has some sort of dietary limitation due to a health condition, so it needs to be gluten-free, or they're allergic to peanuts. We do a lot of food allergies that will come at their office. Have they considered that and thought about having alternatives, options, making sure things are properly labeled? And then attention processing. So, we talk about students who are struggling with attention as one of our highest, most common disabilities. If your meeting environment activity is really hard to pay attention and focus to, is that going to be a barrier for someone? If too much information is being given to them and they're not able to process that. I think Christy had done a presentation of training with student activities, and one of the students talked about the application process can be a barrier. I have a learning disability, and filling out these really long applications, writing these really long essays can really be a challenge for me. Do your applications have to be that intensive, or is there an alternative way? Could they turn in a video? Could they do some other way to apply for your organization that might not be a barrier for a student who might have a learning disability or some sort of processing deficit? And obviously then there's the service animals, about students who do have animals, and do people understand the etiquette and the appropriateness of what to say, what not to say, how to ask, making sure that you've provided the space for those animals as well, and with your members and the people who participate. So if anybody has questions as you're going on, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll pause and answer them. I don't see any at the moment, so I'm going to continue going on. The last area of barriers I want to talk about is attitudinal. It's probably not the one you're thinking. You think of the more tangible things, but a lot of people with disabilities encounter a lot of these, what we call attitudinal barriers in their day-to-day lives. And so there's some research out there, and they talk about these categories. So this concept of inferiority, this assumption, that they're just treated poorly. They're treated like a second-class citizen, like they'll do everything for everybody else, but then they'll consider the needs of this person, they're not as important. Pity, people who feel sorry for the person, they may be patronizing and how they do that. And this is kind of where that concept of charity, people want to do something really nice, or they're trying to get that. Most people with disabilities don't want pity or charity. They just want to be respected and being able to participate in things as independently as possible and live on their own way. Hero worship, I think we sometimes struggle because we have people come to us and they want to tell a really good story about a student and what's going on. And people with disabilities are not brave or special because they do the day-to-day things. They manage their disability, they handle it. When they do things above and beyond that, that's when we want to highlight them. There's a great TED Talk out there that's done by Stella Young called I'm Not Your Inspiration. She's a wheelchair user, and she really talks about like somebody coming in, they wanted to give her an award because she had a job. And she's like, no, I'm not here to be your inspiration. And we'll talk about this concept of inspiration porn, where people will tell these stories about people with disabilities, and it's putting them on this pedestal when that's not what they want. They just want to be respected and treated like everybody else. Ignorance, that automatically you're deeming that somebody's incapable because they have a disability. You assume because they have a disability, they won't be able to do something without asking them if they can or how they can. The spread effect is the concept of, because they have one disability, they may also have another, or people just kind of unintentionally they do it. So that when they assume that somebody who is blind may also have a hearing impairment. They assume that somebody who is in a wheelchair may also have an intellectual disability and not be able to respond. So they talk to the person next to them instead of them. So that concept of just understanding that disability does not bleed into other areas of your senses. Stereotypes, there's positive and negative. Some people assume people who are blind have really great hearing or great musicians, and there's also the negative stereotypes of how that plays around with different types of disabilities and how those are perceived. Backlash, so we hear this sometimes when we're processing a survey in our office, and this concept of people feeling that sometimes people with disabilities have an unfair advantage. Oh, well, you had more time in the test, that's why you did better. And so they feel like they've given this advantage, and they're not being judged on the same level as everybody else. The ADA and the accommodations are not there to give somebody special privileges. It's just to make sure that they have equal access. And so hopefully we wouldn't see that, but that's an attitude that some of our students report, that they've had that from other students, faculty, and others that have said that. Denial, not believing that an accommodation is needed, especially for people with hidden disabilities. People not saying, well, you don't look disabled. I don't know why you would need that. You should be, most people should be able to do it that way or handle it that way. So, a lot of people who have, psychiatric, cancer, anything that's not apparent, sometimes they are questions or challenges why they really need that accommodation. And the last one I have is fear. It's when people are afraid that they might say or do the wrong thing, and to avoid their own discomfort, they just avoid either interacting with that person or following through. So, we all sometimes, I would say I probably am sometimes even guilty of this. I don't know how to respond in a situation, and I have to kind of go past that and make sure I'm not putting that barrier or that attitude on with someone. So any questions on these? All right. So here's the thing. The whole point of what I want to get into today is, how can these student organizations and student leaders meet the needs of those individual disabilities? So I want you guys to think about, consider the ways that you can be inclusive and welcoming. How do you just plan for the common needs? And how do you respond to requests when you get them? So the three things that I just kind of want to talk through. I do also want to talk about through the concept of compliance versus inclusion. The goal of accommodations is to make sure that people have access. So we provide access. But how do you approach that? Do you do it through a lens of compliance, or do you do it through a lens of inclusion? When we talk about compliance, it's usually reactive, right? You're trying to just satisfy the requirement, meet the letter of law, do the bare minimum. What do I need to do to make sure that I don't get sued? So it's that risk management lens of applying for meeting the accommodations. It usually requires somebody to make a request, and it wasn't planned for ahead of time. When we talk for inclusion, it's proactive. You're trying to set a positive example. You want to make sure that people can participate, and you don't even have to have an accommodation or very little need for accommodation. You recognize up front that your participants and the members and the students in the population have a variety of disabilities, and you want to provide options and alternatives so that they can participate as effectively as anyone else without you having to change gears mid-flow of your activity. And this is where people say that they feel welcome, they feel respected and valued, because somebody thought about that without them having to ask. I've heard this from students. They say, like, wow, it was great. I participated in this and it was already captioned. I didn't even have to ask for the captions. I went to this thing and there was plenty of space, and the path for the disabled access was well labeled. I didn't have to ask for that. There was already dietary options that met my needs. Almost never can I eat there, but wow, they had something I could eat. So it's that inclusion. They felt like they were thought about without having to make a specific request. So what are the best practices? I think if you've been during this series, you've probably heard this concept quite a few times, but this concept of universal design. Universal design is an architectural term. It's the concept of building the physical space universally so that you're designing the facility for people with a variety of abilities, disabilities, age, reading levels, and such. And you can do the same thing with your student organization, meetings, events, programs, and stuff as well. Think about that. If you look at the numbers of students that we showed you, you're probably going to have people who have a learning disability, ADHD, mental health, or a health condition. And the other ones might be smaller, but you want to plan for them because they're the hardest ones to plan for when we have to talk about mobility, visual, and hearing. So if you plan ahead, then you don't have to rush and try to change gears at the last minute to try to adjust and accommodate. It's already there and universally accessible. One of the documents I gave to Megan to send out is this document from Do It, which is I always butcher the name. It's like digital. it's like disability opportunities, internetworking, and technology from the University of Washington. They have a lot of great resources for faculty, for educational departments, but they even have a specific one that talks about how to do the universal design of student organizations. A lot of the content I'm pulling from here is really much along the lines of what they have there. So I'll share that document with you a little bit later as we go through.
I just shared it in the chat, Tracy.
Oh, great, thank you. So when you're planning, I'm going to come back to those main areas, but what do you think about the potential mobility dietary needs of the people who might be there participating? Have you thought about these things and you're planning for it? Do you have those options for communication access? Have you thought about the acoustics and amplification? If someone needed an interpreter, how would they make that request? Are your materials and marketing in accessible formats? And then do your leaders, members, advisors, are they aware of potential accommodation needs, how to ask and how to respond if somebody might have a need? And making sure you're giving participants an opportunity to make those requests and putting that out there so that they know that you welcome the opportunity to make your events and meetings and such more accessible for them. So I want to give you a couple of examples, just maybe just kind of talk through some things that people have seen here on campus. Two really big programs that happen on campus every year is sorority recruitment and fish camp. Fish camp has thousands of students go through it, and sorority recruitment has hundreds. and they've handled a variety of things, but these are the ones that stand out to me in my memory of some things that we had to work through. So we had a legally blind student who's a guide dog going through sorority recruitment. And I don't know if many of you know what sorority recruitment looks like, but it's, the traditional, it's their sorority houses, they are on campus, they get bused from campus to the sorority houses, they go to multiple events per day over multiple days. And then they come back to campus and they have to do a pref night, they have to fill out a preference form on that last night. So, we had to sit there and kind of, with the student leaders and the advisor, talk through, how is the student going to find their way to get from, the check-in place to houses, from house to house, to navigate through. And so we just kind of talked about what are the options. And they brainstormed, they came up with, they would have a golf cart at the space and they would kind of help them instead of making them trying to navigate different sidewalks and stuff to get down, and have kind of like one of their advisors at the time. And I wrote down Roganas, I think it might have been Rokais, I've always learned the names, but they're basically organization leaders would kind of be assigned to make sure that person can find their way. At this time, this is a little bit older, they were doing these written daily journals that they had to do and submit. And they were like, well, she's visually impaired, she can't do that. So we made arrangements that they would have a laptop available with her text-to-speech software on it so that she could do those journals every day like everybody else, just in a slightly different way. And then at the preference, when it came to prep nights, when we had to come back to campus, go up to the second floor of the Student Computing Center to fill out the stuff, did we have a computer that she could use that had the software on it? Or would she work with an assistant? And we found out what the student's preference was and try to collaborate with that student to figure out what was the best way to make sure that she could participate at the same level that other students can do. And from that, and this is the first time when I was working with this, they started doing training for their advisors every year. So almost every year since then, we've had some of our staff and disability resources that goes to part of their training that they do to kind of talk through some of these concepts and general disability etiquette and communication skills, topics, things that may come up. And so they've kind of built that into their training program. So these are things that, and as case by case, as things come up, they will sometimes come back and consult with us or staff in Greek life and student activities to figure out how to work through those situations. About 2 or 3 years ago, they had a wheelchair user sign up for a sorority recruitment. The reason we found out is because they called our office to find out, do you have a portable ramp that we could borrow to install at the houses? Because some of the houses don't have ramps. And that's not something our office is going to do. And that's not something that's usually going to be the best answer, because portable ramps are not something that's usually going to be safe, or you have to kind of check that. But we talked to them about, well, look at the routes that you're going to take students from house to house. For the houses that don't have ramp access, you may just be upfront with that student and say, we don't have access to this house. We can provide an alternative way for you to participate or learn more information. And I talked about going back and saying, well, if your house is not physically accessible, this may not be a good match for the student. And so, thinking through, if you want your organization to be more welcoming, do they go back and look at the physical access of their houses and event space, and do they make them more accessible long-term? So, but we also talked about, like, when you're in the houses, having space for wheelchair users for seating and stuff, and making sure that they had a bus that would also be wheelchair accessible as they went through. So very practical, but just, for a student organization leader, that's a lot of information to process. So we try to be supportive with them and to the advisor and try to help them figure out how to connect that information together, how to have that conversation with the student to make sure that their needs are met, as well as that the organization planners knew what to do and how to do that. So fish camp. We've had a lot of fish camp stuff in the last 15 years or so I've been with there. I mean, it's a 4-day, 3-night, 4-day retreat. A lot of things get into play when you start talking about overnight activities and such. So dietary accommodation requests, they do this all the time. So people who have a variety of dietary needs. I remember going through a situation where they had a student who needed a sign language interpreter. And so if you have not been to fish camp, it's like all day. So like 8, 9 o'clock in the morning to events that are happening until 11 o'clock at night. And when we found a student who needed an interpreter, letting them know, well, and here's the cost of an interpreter. And so it's going to be somewhere between $65 to $80 an hour. You might need 2 interpreters for long events, and trying to figure out the budget, because fish camp hadn't thought about what would they do if they needed to pay for an interpreter to be available most of the day for 4 days. So we talked to them about planning for that, figuring out how to budget, how do you schedule, finding a interpreter who's in the Palestine area, making sure they have placement for lighting and stuff. A lot of times they'll turn the lights down really low, so trying to figure out how to do that to make sure this person had access. Did the student want it for every single activity? Were they okay with one-on-one conversations, either reading lips, or was their hearing impairment to a level that they could hear in smaller groups? We kind of help them talk through and figure out how to do that. Captioning of videos. If you've ever been to fish camp or participated in fish camp, there are lots and lots of videos. Their videos are mostly created actually by the different camps and by departments and organizations who do send information up to fish camp for them to present. And so they had to work with all those different organizations and departments and entities to make sure that the videos they submitted are being captioned. And then I'm trying to work with the people who are up in the AV box to make sure that they're turning the captions on during the different events and things. So it's come together. It's getting better. Every time I go up there as a sports staff member, I'm trying to make sure that they're doing it. I'm doing a little bit of check and making sure that they're trying to follow through. But I would say that it's also usability. The sound quality in a lot of those rooms is hard to do until you have the captions on. It becomes a universal design concept. When you have the captions on, it's much more effective if you have those videos captioned during those events. At Fish Camp, we've had a number of students who are wheelchair users go to Fish Camp and walker access. So we did very purposeful placement in certain types of cabins or different camps. And so if you've been up there, some of the camps are a little bit older. They may have some accessibility barriers for the physical space, the stage, or some of the cabins. Some of them are newer and they have ADA accessible restrooms and spaces that we try to place there. They have had in both T-Camp and in Fish Camp, they've had wheelchair users who are counselors, and I think that also has helped them to think through because they've had to think of it not just from the student participant side, but also from the staff side. We have had students who needed personal attendance go to Fish Camp and work with them through the process of having another place where a family member or somebody could come who would stay there, who would help them with their daily needs, like getting ready, dressed, and stuff during the 4 days, and then making those arrangements. We've had a couple of students who had autoimmune conditions, and so they're really uncomfortable staying in the big cabin space, and they actually provided them another space of what they call a family life center, so they could be in a more private space away from people so they wouldn't be as exposed to other potential autoimmune concerns. So these are some very complex things that a student organization really had to kind of work through and figure out and work with that student and the student leaders to facilitate. Accessible transportation. I think one of the first times I was here, we had a wheelchair user. The bus company that they were using did not have wheelchair accessible buses. And so they had to contract with transportation services to actually have one of our buses transport that student. And then we had some of the other students and counselors transport with them, so they weren't just on the bus by themselves. So these are some of the ways that they've kind of approached some of those physical, visual hearing type things. But the other thing that comes up in Fish Camp is that this is a 4-day intense, lots of people, loud chanting activity, and those group activities in loud environments. We've seen a number of students who have anxiety, social anxiety, some sort of autism spectrum, really struggled and might need time to get away. So, we're trying to coach the advisors and stuff about what to do if somebody does appear to be having a panic attack or is really stressed out, like how to kind of address some of those situations so they can kind of provide a safe space for them to do that. So one thing that they've been doing for a while, but they have a thing called the aquarium. So if people don't want to go to the big dances at night, there's something smaller. If they want to be in smaller groups, there's some other spaces there. Some of that's been happening naturally, but I think it's also making sure that people know what their options are. And that becomes that universal design. If I don't want to do something in this activity, I have another option. I don't feel like I'm left out. It's just another option of something to do during that time. And then we've been doing awareness training for Fish Camp counselors, the directors and their staff, at least once a year for their training days for probably the last 5 or 6 years. And so I think that's been very helpful because that's affecting hundreds of leaders who are working with thousands of freshmen. And so that kind of brings that awareness to there. Some other things that we've seen. Do you have a question, Christy?
I actually just wanted to see if you could expand. You kind of mentioned, but I wanted to see if you could expand a little bit on, you mentioned like the bus example of having not just one person ride on the bus by themselves, and thinking about just in planning, you could provide access just by, doing something different for someone. But can you talk a little bit just about trying to be inclusive in that planning?
So let me, I guess, to expand on that, when we provide access, we want to make sure that it's inclusive access. It's not just, putting somebody in a different space that's accessible and everybody else is in one space. You want to make sure that they're as integrated into the activity as possible. I think when we've talked about with Fish Camp students, a lot of times they'll do a lot of these team builder games and stuff. Well, what if somebody couldn't physically participate? Do they just sit on the side by themselves and everybody else participates? Do some other people sit with them? Do you find a more accessible way to do that activity so they could be fully included into the activity and not feel like they have to be left out? And I think the hard part with that is sometimes you just want to talk to the student and find out what they would be comfortable with. Sometimes they might be totally fine with, I'm okay not participating in this one activity, not a big deal. But if I'm going to miss half the day because I can't do the ropes course, that's not inclusive. So how do we make sure? And then obviously, you want to have accessible transportation, but if there's the only person who needs the accessible transportation is one person, you don't want to just put them on a bus by themselves. And can you imagine being a freshman who goes to Fish Camp and everybody, there's 40 people on 30 buses and they're on a bus by themselves with like one other person? That's not very inclusive. So the more people that you would include, it may be a little different, but is it equitable and as similar as possible to that activity? So that's what you want to think about, is how do you make that as accessible? With seating, sometimes the accessible seating in certain rooms and classrooms is like the last row or the front row. Well, do you leave the person who is there at the back row by themselves while everybody else is in the first 10 rows of that meeting room? Or do you spread people out, or you make sure that it's distributed so that they just feel like they're included and their space just happens to be in this area that they're accessible? So that's that concept of inclusion. So here are two other big things that we've kind of consulted on. So Midnight Yale, we've been doing Midnight Yales for a long time, but making sure, especially after renovations and before renovations, how do people find the accessible path and making sure that's advertised. We actually have information on our website that we put up just to help with that. So people are trying to get into Midnight Yale or to football games, knowing where those paths are. And then a few years ago, we had our Deaf Aggies and Friends organization asked to have an interpreter at Midnight Yale. And so we kind of help facilitate that conversation with the people who coordinate Midnight Yale, the logistics of scheduling and the cost, making sure that there's a special section so that anybody who needed that would be close enough to be able to see and focus on the interpreter and the event happening. So when you place an interpreter, you don't place them all over to the side where they can't see what's going on. They need to be in line of sight with the interpreter and who's speaking. So making sure that that was placed there. Sometimes we've done this and it's been for like one or two events and then it stops because there wasn't a request. Well, they've been keeping it. And I think it's been for the last 2 years. I don't know in the pandemic if they've been doing it, but they've been consistently having an interpreter at Midnight Yale. And thousands of people go to Midnight Yale. So it's a huge event. So having it there is really it's a best practice to have it because it most likely will be somebody who would benefit from that. An article was done in the battalion last year, the second year of them, about how they did it in the logistics and it seems to be being very useful and accommodating. We've also consulted with the people who coordinate the bonfire remembrance ceremony and the memorial tours about the bonfire memorial. So they wanted to kind of model over what Midnight Yale did with having an interpreter. And we kind of talked about those logistics because it's typically really dark and it's usually people don't talk. And so trying to figure out where would you place them? How would you do lighting? How would you know people who are coming just very quietly know where to go and how to be situated? And then making sure we're communicating that to the local deaf and hard of hearing population so they would know where to go and how to get there if they have questions, who to contact. We've also talked about for many years the limitations in the physical access. That gravel path was really not accessible for people with physical disabilities, and they actually have done upgrades. It's something that we've been talking about so that there is now an accessible path to get out to the bonfire memorial. I know I've talked with the MSC hospitality people on and off over the years about how can they make their tours more accessible. There's a lot of stuff on the website, making sure that those things are captioned. If they are going to do audio tours, is there also a transcript? And so these are things like if your organization does things like this, the paths that you take, the media that you create, the opportunity, if you are scheduling an event and having an interpreter, what would you do and where would you place them? And thinking about that ahead of time, because if you get the request 4 days before your event, you don't want to be thinking about that at the last minute when you're trying to finish all the last minute logistics. And then a couple more, others, just examples. Right before the pandemic, I met with one of the leaders for Fish Fest, and they were trying to think through how they would handle Fish Fest last year. And they were planning on doing stuff on Simpson Drill Field with a stage and stuff like that. And I just kind of questioned them. I said, well, it's all grass. What would you do if somebody was in a mobility device? Would they have access? Would they be pushed off to the side, or would they be included in the group? So we kind of talked through those. They talked about having food, and I asked the question about what kind of food and how, if somebody had a dietary need, was there an alternative? We talked to them about their marketing and how they're promoting that and stuff. So lots of this, having these conversations, having them think through. And so as an advisor, since a lot of you are staff, have you just kind of given them those things to think about as just part of the bigger picture of planning your event? And what are they going to move forward in planning that event and making sure it's as accessible as possible for the common things? And then your advertisements, do they have something that says if you have a question or require an accommodation, who do they contact to find out about that? Because if they don't know what to expect, a lot of times they won't come because they're going to be afraid it's not going to be accessible. So, and then a real simple one, because I've been talking about big organizations. My guess is a lot of you probably work with smaller organizations. But even small organizations can have these things come up, and they could come up at the last minute. So one of the ones that I think of that happened right during a Howdy Week. So Howdy Week, a lot of the student organizations and departments will have activities that week right before school. And there was a self-defense class that was sponsored by a student organization with the university police. And they had like 2 days before, somebody wanted a sign language interpreter. and this was like, oh my gosh, how do we do this? Who's going to pay for it? And that kind of stuff. And we kind of talked through that. And in that case, we were able to help facilitate that one. But typically, our office is funded for academic interpreting. We usually don't have that opportunity or the funding or the staffing to do that. And so that student organization may have had to come up with, for a 2-hour, class, that $160 to pay for that interpreter for that one event. And had they thought about what would they do, how would they get that funded? So. Does anybody have any specific examples you're thinking about that you've had, things that have come up that you're like, how do we do that?
Feel free to unmute yourself, or you can put something in the chat if you do have an example or a question.
It's okay if you don't. I just wanted to pause and give a moment. So I want you to think. So this is my asking you is, I want you to think about the organizations that you work with or advise, or your offices, if you're coming from that staff or faculty thing. How do you advertise your meetings, events, and activities? Do you use social media? Do you emails? Are they just as JPEG graphics? Are your videos captioned? Can you change this from this point forward, or can you build this into your process? You're already doing it. If you're doing paper flyers, do you actually also make sure that there's a digital accessible version that you put out, not just the image only PDF, but you've actually put in an accessible PDF format or link to a web page that has the accessible information? And then is your website accessible? So I believe that Cynthia Cowder is on this call, and she'll be talking about all types of stuff with web accessibility, but making sure that those accessible electronic materials are available for potential participants. Think about the space. From the regular meeting that you do every week to your large events, and what are the potential barriers that could be there? Are there any barriers for someone with mobility need? What are the acoustics like? Should you be using a microphone? For those of us who are doing virtual meetings, do you just automatically enable the captioning? Because I think that's a very helpful thing for attention focus and for people who may have some sort of hearing impairment. And then think about the environment of your activity, and would that be a barrier for somebody? So how crowded is it? What does the space look like? Is this something that could be a barrier, and could we do it differently, or can we consider how we could do it differently if that came up? All right, then how would you do the requests? So, in some of the larger organizations, usually you have a risk management officer. So would that person be the person who would kind of vet any kind of accommodation request? Do you actually let your members know, who should they contact if they have a potential question or an accommodation request, right? I look at this as that at the beginning of every semester, every instructor will go over their syllabus statement. They usually have to talk about the ADA accommodation process. Would it make sense for your student organizations to kind of say, hey, this is our organization, this is our plan, and if you may have some sort of disability or health-related need, and we need to be aware of it, please contact, Jane, who's our Vice President for Risk Management. She'd be happy to talk to you about your needs. I think if somebody just says, hey, I'm open to this, and if you can ask me, that may also make them feel more welcome. Even if they don't ask for it, they know if they had a question or concern who they could go to. And then, making sure that when you're doing major events, that you're making sure that they know how to make requests and who to contact. And then if there is a cost, thinking about what you might do to plan for that cost, or what you would do for specialized funding. And we'll talk about an option there in just a second. And then, are your staff members, your officers, leaders, anybody who's involved in facilitating these activities aware of what are those some common needs, and how would they respond if there was a request or a concern? Does your social media coordinator know how to make accessible content in social media? So do they need some training in that area or not? And if you have a webmaster, do they need a training in that area? And what other training might be needed based on your organization, the dynamics and the activities that you put on? And do they need to have some more knowledge to do their job more effectively in thinking about the disability accommodation process? So some other tips, I just put these kind of in the resource area, but if you're trying to look at an event, well, how do you assess the physical accessibility of the space? From the ADA government.gov website, there's actually a checklist. This is like a 10-page, really simple, like looking about the accessible paths, look at the bathrooms, what's the distance between the spaces. It kind of gives you a way to walk through a facility and determine are there some potential barriers or not and how to work for them. For people who are looking at websites and digital media, our IT accessibility website for the university has a whole bunch of how-tos for website, document, and video accessibility. They also sponsor some trainings through Human Resources Employee Organization Development. And so if you're looking to do a more formal training for an advisor or somebody who needs to know a little bit more in depth, you can definitely send someone to those kind of trainings as well as these reference documents. And then just making sure that people know how to make those inquiries. So always make sure that for big events, conferences, meetings, that you have that statement. And then that idea of mentioning it maybe in the first meeting so that people can make those requests or know who to make the requests if they have a concern. The other resources I would suggest on campus that, obviously us, disability resources, we're here to be, we look at our job is to help facilitate, and collaborate in doing accommodation. So we'll work with faculty, staff, and students to figure out how to do that. While it may not be our responsibility or it might not come out of our budget, we'll help people think through those situations, look at the resources, figure out how to approach or how to address something that comes up. So please reach out to us. We're happy to consult. I mentioned that we've done an advisor training video. So one of the modules that's in StuAct Online is the supporting and including students with disability, a good thing, something maybe as an introductory for your student leaders to do, maybe as an optional training, encourage them to listen to that and think about their groups and what they may want to plan for. And then we worked with student activities a few years ago about their planning form, like the Maroon Lake pre-planning form, to have some questions in there, and it prompts people as part of that process to do the question for do you require accommodations and some things to think about for dietary needs and such. Second, I'd say the Office of Risk Ethics and Compliance. I believe Julie may be joining us on our thing today, but they're a great resource if you're trying to figure out, when the question comes is, what am I legally required? What do I have to do? Am I potentially putting myself in jeopardy? They're a great consultant when you're trying to figure out what is required, how to go about it, and where are those resources on campus. If you don't know, they're also the primary contact for visitors who have accommodation questions. So if you have people participating or not, Texas A&M faculty, staff, and students, and want to understand what your role is, and if you have questions about how to do that, the ADA coordinator's office is probably a really good place to start to kind of talk through those situations. In general on campus, if there's a student who needs accommodation, they have questions, they will typically come to our office or consult with our office. If it's faculty or staff, it'll go to employee relations. And if it's a visitor, it goes to the ADA coordinator's office. They also have two office resources on their webpage, one specifically about hosting events, which talks about a lot of these topics we did today, and also pointing you to some certain contacts within housing. So if you're doing conference housing and you need to talk about accessibility in housing, who to contact there. In the University Center, who to talk about if you need something about the University Center facilities. And then obviously we're listed on that page as well as a consultant. They have a resource page on service animals to understand what you should or should not do, what you can or cannot ask, what's the difference between a service animal and an emotional support animal, and understanding those rights. And so there's some great resources on their website as well. Student activities. So all these recognized student organizations know that student activities is also a great resource. Their SOTA office, the Student Organization Development Administration Office, they're there to help people with the risk management considerations. And so, if they get something really complex, they'll reach out to us or others, but they're a great starting point if you're just trying to work through. They have lots of information. They're the ones who look through those pre-event planning forms and sometimes may come back and ask those challenging questions. And then what we've consulted with them about some of those things if they come up. They do also have, and a lot of people don't know this, but they have some risk initiative funding and some general funding. And so they actually have a fund specifically for organizations who are recognized to apply. It has to do with cost for risk management. So here it is. You've got a 4-day conference and you now have to have an interpreter. You hadn't planned it for your budget. You potentially can get some supplemental funding for this to help offset the cost of that. Now, if it happens every year, that should be put in your budget. But if it's a one-time thing that comes up, they may be able to help with funding some sort of accommodation that you hadn't planned for accommodating. And then they also have, if you didn't know, for student organizations, that there's a way that groups can apply for regular funding to help with their yearly things, and it's an annual process that they go through. And so that may be another way if you're trying to think, well, how would I support pay for this? This may be another way. And then I talked about the stuff from the University of Washington. This is a direct link to the checklist that Christy put in there. And this talks about the planning policies, the physical environment, how to train and educate your staff, the IT stuff. And it also has this really great section on communication hints. We sometimes get asked to come and talk about disability etiquette. And I think really what is, how do you effectively communicate and talk about disabilities? And so I have on the page that is linked here at the very bottom of it is a specific page about their communication. And that is going to look like, at the bottom, it talks about, like, generally, you know, these are common things, but, you know, if you have a person with disability that looks like they might need help, you don't just help them, you usually ask them before you help them. But you talk to, you know, have somebody with interpreter, you talk to the person, not to the interpreter. You know, not touching or moving somebody's mobility device without the permission of the individual. You know, how to talk to somebody who has a visual impairment, and, you know, things to say or not to say, or what may or may not be considered appropriate. So this is really great training materials if you want to share this with some of your student organization leaders and advisors. The first time they've ever interacted with a person with disability in their fish camp discussion group, this maybe some kind of help alleviate some of their concerns or suggestions about how to be more effective in their communication with those students. And then there's me. And so I'm always happy to be a consultant and see if I can help walk through specific situations or hypothetical situations or what if situations, and the rest of the staff in our office as well would be happy to do that as in addition. So that's my content. I knew it wasn't going to take an entire hour, but I got most of it. Are there any questions I can answer?
You are pretty close to your hour, Tracy. So okay. I have been putting some of the links that Tracy has in the chat, but they are also in the handouts that she sent. So the presentation Megan sent out, it's also on the Accessibility and Aggieland website, which I'm going to link again. So if you go to that website, you can find all of the presentations that have happened so far, including this presentation today. The videos for the presentations that have already happened are also there. And as long as I don't mess it up, the video from today will be there after today. And then also the presentations coming up. So I will talk about those in just a minute because Tiana has a question and we're going to let her unmute and ask her question.
So it's nothing major, but sometimes I work with community users and school groups who are not A&M students, so they don't qualify for your services. But would I be able to just, if I needed ideas of what I could do, like just consult with you to help give me ideas because they don't qualify, but sometimes I just might need your knowledge.
Happy to do that. And I think we've had a couple, I think there was like a 4-H program and there was something, it really got to be legalistic. They started asking, well, do we have to do this? We brought in general counsel because we didn't want to make a legal guidance, but we can give you some general guidance and resources. And if it comes back to a what's legally required, we're going to take you up to either the ADA coordinator's office or the general counsel before you make a decline an accommodation request.
Great question. So since we are almost at the end of time, I do want to let you know that you will be getting an evaluation. So Megan will be sending that out. We really appreciate the feedback. This has been a really great series for us, and hopefully we will be able to continue and expand this series moving forward. Next week, there will be a presentation on Canvas accessibility. So really more so geared for faculty or anyone who's using Canvas for courses, or if you're using it for something else. So that'll be a great presentation by Dr. Travis Irby from Academic Innovation. The week after that, we'll have a virtual accessibility presentation from Cynthia Cowder from Electronic and Information Resources about web accessibility and some of that information that will be really helpful for anyone that's involved with the website at all. And then May 13th, as I already mentioned, we have Everyday Ableism, Unpacking Disability Stereotypes and Microaggressions by Dr. Amanda Krause. I'm hoping we have a really great turnout for that. Tracy is happy to continue to be a resource for you, and so am I. And we do a lot of consulting, like Tracy mentioned from Tiana's question, but we do try to be a little careful that we don't go too far and tell you what accommodations to provide, but especially from a proactive standpoint, hopefully that's something that you've seen from Tracy's presentation. You don't have to have all the answers, but the fact that you're thinking about the activities that happen in student organizations. I think one of the things I wrote down is we see with icebreakers a lot of the time, those can be a huge challenge if you haven't thought about, Tracy mentioned like ropes courses or things like that at fish camp. If you haven't thought about the fact there could be someone who's blind or a wheelchair user or someone who's deaf, and how do you accommodate in those situations? That's something to really think about ahead of time and not wait till you're in the situation of trying to figure out what to do. So I think being proactive is the key takeaway, is thinking through what you could do to make the organizations more accessible.
The last thing I'd say is that, a lot of people with temporary disabilities also show up at your events and meetings. And so if people have a struggle with the concept of, well, how many, mobility device users we have, well, how many people with broken legs and broken arms are going to show up at your events? And if they can't participate, they're also going to feel left out. So I think sometimes that's going to be pretty common. And so we're always trucking people around fish camp and golf carts. So we're, changing the flow of how we do things. We're having somebody make sure they get from one place to another, or they're doing something, having somebody help them with something if they can't physically get their own meal. You do the same thing for somebody who is a mobility device user who needs that same type of assistance long-term as opposed to temporary. So.
Any last questions before you go? Well, thank you very much, Tracy, for agreeing to do this presentation. And we appreciate all of you for being here, especially those that have been here for several presentations. And feel free to register for the ones that are coming up. We'd love to see you again. Thank you and have a great day, everyone. Okay, Tracy, if I just stop recording, it'll like do the little, it'll like take me, it'll whatever, pop up a thing, right?